5 disclaimers. First, this is a video essay on the 1997 film Lost Highway, directed by David Lynch, which means that this discussion will spoil all of the characters and events. That is, it will reveal such things. So please be aware about that. Second, David Lynch's films are very famously difficult to talk about, and not just because of their substance. For although David Lynch famously refused to explain or even entertain specific explanations of his films, he always urged his audiences to be like detectives, to follow clues, to enjoy puzzling things over, and to figure things out for ourselves. Some of my fellow Lynch fans, therefore, may view this video essay as a guy sharing too much of his own detective work, and fair enough. Hence this second disclaimer. Even if you have already seen, thought about, and enjoyed Lost Highway, the detective work that I've done that I want to share with others might interfere with your own detective work, so please be aware of that. Third, and crucially, there is much more to this film than the ideas I'm going to argue it conveys. This is very important. My analysis is not meant to be reductive in the sense of capturing or explaining every little thing about the film that there is to be enjoyed. I don't go in for such things. I'm merely proposing an interpretive stance from which to look at the film, or, if you like, an interpretive lens through which to examine the film, and in so doing, hopefully see a little bit more of its depth. Fourth, I want to acknowledge that yes, cinema has its own modes of expression, its own way of conveying ideas, and so cinematic messaging or cinematic ideas cannot ever be reduced to or translated into a set of claims, whether they're declarative claims or poetic claims. To riff on Wittgenstein, what can be shown in cinema cannot be said in, say, an analysis. The beauty of the shot composition and the Foley and the film score, these are all things that I cannot capture, nor would I aim to capture in what I'm about to talk about. So please don't think that I'm trying to do the impossible. Fifth, and finally, while it's important to me that what I have to say about the film is consistent with what the writers David Lynch and Barry Gifford have to say about it, none of my argument, that is to say, none of my analysis, rests on quoting David Lynch or Barry Gifford or talking about what they intended or anything like that. In other words, I'm not going to argue that this particular character or that particular series of events means X because David Lynch talked about X or because Barry Gifford talked about X. I aim for my analysis to be consistent with what they said, yes, but I'm not citing it in the course of explaining or justifying my analysis. And on that note, none of my analysis is based on, say, facts about the film's production, facts about the filmographies of its actors, facts about which other films were released around the same time and what was going on in them. My analysis comes from this film itself, its images, its events, its ideas, its themes. I'm going to look at it, and I'm going to share my detective work with you. I love this film, I imagine you do too, and I hope you enjoy what I have to say. So, let's get started. By his own account, much of David Lynch's work expresses ideas that he fell in love with and other ideas which became attracted to those ideas. Some of these ideas are not only abstract in the sense of being general or vague, they're also represented in his work in such a way where if you ask who this character is or what that event means, the answer may very well be one of those ideas, or a part of one of those ideas, or a collection of those ideas. In this way, characters and settings in David Lynch's work can not only function as characters and settings in the conventional narrative sense, they can also function as symbols, abstractions. This is true in many works of art, of course, often true in the works of David Lynch, and I think is true definitely in Lost Highway, in both halves of the film. Now, for the sake of clarity, I'm going to give a name to the thesis I'm going to defend and elaborate on in this video essay. I'm going to call it the Murderer's Fugue interpretation of Lost Highway. The Murderer's Fugue interpretation of Lost Highway has 3 parts, or it asserts 3 claims. First, that the film's first half depicts Fred's murder of Renee from his perspective. Second, that the film's second half depicts Fred's failed effort to escape who he is and become another person, again from his perspective. And third, that the film both concludes with Fred's execution, but also, in some yet-to-be-specified sense, ends where it begins. Now, these three claims together make up the murderer's fugue interpretation of Lost Highway. I'm going to refer to it as the murderer's fugue, or sometimes just the fugue interpretation. And this interpretation shows up quite frequently when you ask people who like Lost Highway about Lost Highway. Now, I think the murderer's interpretation is true. That's right. I think this is correct. But it requires some elaboration, and it requires some further analysis than what I often see conjoined with these claims. In particular, the murderer's fugue interpretation faces the following questions. These are questions that I've just seen come up or get raised, sometimes as honest questions asking for more detail, sometimes raised as attempted objections or refutations of the murderer's fugue. But here are what we'll call some outstanding questions for the murderer's fugue interpretation of Lost Highway. First, how and why does Fred tell himself that Dick Laurent is dead? Second, how can the detectives counsel each other at the end if half of them are from Fred's mind? Third, why does Pete look the way he does when he first appears in Fred's cell, and why does that change? 4. Why does Dick Laurent have two names in both parts of the film? 5. Who is Andy exactly? 6. Who is the mystery man? 7. Why is the tailgating scene there? And there are other questions besides these. Now, I personally don't think all these questions are equally important. I don't think all these questions are even equally good, but I do think they all have answers, and I hope to present those answers, or enough of those answers, in the course of my analysis where you can see some way of responding to them. Here are two more specific claims that'll basically constitute what I'm arguing for. First, the film's narrative loop is psychological, not temporal. It's insecurity leading to violence leading to insecurity. Fred tells himself that Dick is dead, which makes him murder Renee, which makes him tell himself that Dick is dead as he murders Dick, which makes him tell himself that Dick is dead. Now, the motor which drives this whole out-of-control spiraling is Fred's dark, toxic obsession with the ability to have her. Fred wants to have Renee, but he's already told himself that his Dick is dead, so he's insecure, so he sees every difficulty with Renee as a further emasculation. This drives him to murder her, and in his fugue that involves becoming another person, he imagines, at least at first, that he has a wonderful relationship with the masculine ideal of being able to have her. But what does she do? She drives a wedge between him and that masculine ideal. Further insecurity leading to further violence. The question of whether Fred can have Renee, or whether Peter can have Alice, which is really the same question, is the central key both to understanding the film Lost Highway, as well as to properly understanding the murderer's fugue interpretation of the film. That's the thing that I'm going to add to the murderer's fugue, and I'm going to explain how this all works, how it all applies. I'm going to go through the film, not entirely, but mostly in order, because I think after you've seen the film a couple of times and thought about it, the clues turn out to be best laid out and approached when you go in order in the film. That may sound like a lot, so why don't we go through the film as I mentioned I would. The film opens with the event of Fred Madison hearing a buzz at his front door, and when he checks who it is, he hears a voice saying, "Dick Laurent is dead." He goes and tries to see who's at the door, who could have said that, but when he finally gets to a window to observe, nobody's there. This initial event is supposed to be puzzling by giving us an event to puzzle over. Because we've seen the whole movie, we should also consider the detail that this would lead to. The voice informing Fred of Dick Laurent's death is his own. So let's begin with this fact. When it comes to the story that this movie tells, It all started when Fred told himself that Dick Laurent is dead. I think the phrasing is important. Let's take a note of that. It all starts when Fred tells himself that Dick Laurent is dead. After this puzzle, I guess we should get to know Fred. What happens next? After telling himself that Dick Laurent is dead, Renee asks Fred if he minds that she won't see him play the saxophone at the club. Does he mind? Will he get mad? And instead of saying whether he minds, Fred asks a rather accusing, suspicious question. What are you gonna do? And the question itself is not necessarily accusing, but the tone is sort of suspicious or inquiring, almost accusatory. The scene feels tense. You can feel Fred trying to control Renee, or more specifically, try to have her. She says that she's going to read, an evasion. He says, read what? She laughs, another evasion. In an effort to finally have her or exert some control, he tries to take some responsibility for the laugh. I could always make you laugh, he says. But her response is yet another evasion. I like to laugh, Fred. Meaning, she could just be laughing. It's nothing that he did. He does not have her. So at the very last, he gives up and says, that's why I married you. At least relying on the fact that they're married to, in some sense, control or have her. The whole scene feels thick with paranoia. Fred moves closer to Renee with this slow, very subtle swagger, and when he smiles, he bares his teeth, and it's right on the line, just on the ambiguity between affectionate and aggressive. It's a tense, possessive atmosphere, and is presented to us right under the rubric of the question, does he mind? And hey, let's turn to that question. How does Fred feel? Does Fred mind? Is he mad? Fred is introduced grimacing irritably, puffing on a cigarette that's lit with smoke and fire. When he calls Renee after his jazz performance, he's bathed in red light while glowering at the camera. He angrily shouts at dogs barking, demanding to know who owns them. He shouts impatiently at Renee to watch videotapes. He demands to know what Renee is doing and how she knows people, and he scolds Renee when she gets out of the car despite his veto. Even sex with Renee leaves Fred silently enraged. So yes, without even taking into account the murder that occurs, the film is telling us that Fred is mad. Fred mad. It's even in his name, Madison. Which leads to the question, what is Fred mad about? Why Fred mad? So we just saw Fred's anger at Renee's evasiveness, or her inability to be had or controlled, and we're going to see a few more instances of anger at Fred not being able to control or to have Renee. So Fred is mad, and his anger is tied to a series of emasculations, and those emasculations were introduced with Fred telling himself that Dick Laurent is dead. After the talk before the jazz club, the next emasculation for Fred occurs at the jazz club, where he plays saxophone, and he plays a very specific, particular sort of melody. At the very end, when the rest of the band cuts out, the saxophone keeps going. Fred is playing at the upper end of the instrument's register, which makes the notes sound like they're straining. They're reaching, they're exerting effort. And more than that, the melody consists of a series of notes that are gathered not quite at, but nearly as high as the instrument can go. It's like the melody is jumping to try to reach something high up, and it can't quite reach it, but it's trying to reach that height and faltering. What does this tell us? What does it mean? Well, musically, Fred is struggling to keep it up. Yes, it's a sex thing. Not just because sax rhymes with sex, not just because the sax is held between Fred's legs, you could say it's kind of phallic-shaped, but also in the melody itself. The melody says, struggling to keep it up, and sure enough, this scene foreshadows actual impotence or actual trouble Fred has in the bed making love to Renee. This may sound silly, but remember, David Lynch does not include things in his films just randomly. And this is also the film that contains this.
Give you a boner?
It's in there, I'm telling you. The melody that Fred plays on his saxophone communicates that he's struggling to keep it up. At the same time, Renee, who said that she would be at home reading, seems to leave that very club with another man, who we will later be introduced to as Andy. It's from Fred's perspective, but Renee seems to be unfaithful, leaving that club with another man after she said that she was going to be at home reading. Sure enough, when Fred calls to check on Renee after his performance, she doesn't answer, and the light shines on him as bright red, and he's grimacing and glowering at the camera. Fred mad. So Renee was not interested in Fred's performance with an instrument that's kind of phallic-shaped that he holds between his legs and with which he struggles to keep it up. Instead, she left the club with another man, Andy. Later, Fred tries and fails to make love to Renee, and he is enraged, even more so as she pats him and says, "It's okay, it's okay." He then describes a nightmare where he couldn't find Renee, but violently found someone else who was just like her. And at that moment, the mystery man's face flashes where Renee's should be. So we're introduced to both Andy and the mystery man at about the same time, and they both appear after several scenes where Mad Fred seems emasculated after he told himself that Dick is dead. So let's talk about these two new characters. Now, Andy is a great name for the concept of other guys, or for the concept of another man. First of all, the name begins with and, which means with, or also. An also-y guy would be an and-y guy, right? But also, Andy sounds like any, which means that he could be Andy-buddy. And as you may have noticed, we only see this guy when he's perceived as being a secretly successful rival to some woman's affection. Andy seems to leave the club with Renee as Fred performs. Andy dances sensually with Renee while Fred fetches Renee a drink. And in the second half of the film, this role is going to be exaggerated to the point where Andy is a voracious consumer of women. Now, it's important to note that when Fred says at the party, Dick Laurent is dead, Andy asks two questions. First, who said that? Who did say that? Well, Fred did. Not only just now Fred said it, but we also learn at the end of the film that the voice from the beginning was Fred's. So the answer to Andy's question, who said Dick Laurent is dead? Fred did. And then Andy says a second thing. He says, no, 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 that can't be true. So Fred reports that Dick is dead, but Andy doesn't report that Dick is dead. If it's starting to seem like Dick Laurent is a symbol for something, like maybe a symbol for masculinity or something, yes, we're going there, but it's not masculinity. Dick Laurent is a symbol for the power or the virility, the dominance, the ability to have her. And this is true in both parts of the film, and we'll get into the details, but don't get ahead of me. For now, Andy represents the concept of other guys, especially romantic rivals, and especially secretly successful romantic rivals. And as for everyone's favorite character, the mystery man, the mystery man's face first appears in a flash in the place of Renee's face right after Fred fails to successfully make love to Renee. Not that failure and success are a normatively good way to talk about making love, but this is from Fred's perspective. Fred fails at lovemaking, describes a dream where he lethally found someone just like Renee, and then he sees a flash of the mystery man's face in the place of Renee's face. When Fred later talks to the mystery man at the party at Andy's, he learns that he invited the mystery man in. So presumably, that flash of the mystery man's face in the place of Renee's was at or shortly after Fred invited the mystery man in. So what was the invitation? Well, it was either the poor lovemaking, or more likely, the anger and the description of a nightmare in which he finds someone just like Renee, finding her in a way that seems like killing. I submit that the mystery man is Fred's murderous intent. He shows up after a series of events which seem to emasculate and enrage Fred, and as soon as he's in the house, Renee's life is in danger, and even though it's Fred's murderous intent, we see appropriately that it is projected onto Renee. His face looks projected onto her as if from a film projector, and indeed, this is accurate emotionally. Fred's murderous intent is projected onto Renee. The mystery man is Fred's murderous intent. Now, crucially, Fred does not recognize his own murderous intent. He says, "No, I don't think so. Where is it exactly you think that we've met?"
I don't think so.
Fred is estranged from or alienated from his own murderous intent. He doesn't recognize it. It seems like someone else. Now, when the topic of who the mystery man is comes up, Andy says he thinks that guy is a friend of Dick Laurent's. And we might ask why. If Dick Laurent, as I'm going to argue, represents something like virility and the ability to have her, why would that be associated with murderous intent? Well, it's important to remember that this is all from Fred's perspective, but I think the association goes something like this, that there's a perceived association between virility and masculinity, and then another perceived association between masculinity and the willingness to kill. Something like that. I don't think it's secure or for certain. I think it's kind of a vague affair, and I think that may be why Andy tells us that he's not quite sure, but he thinks that the mystery man is friends with Dick Laurent. In any case, I think that the mystery man is Fred's murderous intent, which shows up right after he gets mad after a series of emasculations, which he in turn perceived after he told himself that Dick Laurent is dead. As for the process of the mystery man showing up, let's turn to the videotapes. 3 videotapes arrive at Fred and Renee's house, and it's worth noting both what's on those tapes as well as what's going on in the film around the time that those tapes arrive. The first videotape shows the outside of the house, the second videotape shows the inside, and the third and final videotape shows Fred murdering, or rather having murdered and dismembered, Renee. So if you take them together, it looks like you have something first outside the house, then in the house, then murdering Renee at the center of the house. In other words, the tapes together document something moving inside and being instrumental to Renee's killing. I think the tapes show the progress of Fred Madison's murderous intent coming into the house and then activating. This adds up if you take a look at what's going on in the film as those tapes arrive. The first tape arrives after Fred is emasculated from Ray seeming to leave the club with Andy instead of watching his performance. The second videotape arrives after Fred's failed attempts at lovemaking. This is when the mystery man's face appeared in the place of Renee's, projected onto Renee's. And the last tape arrives after Fred talks to his own murderous intent at the party, that is to say, after he talks to the mystery man, and also after he loses his temper at Renee not obeying him when he tells her to stay in the car. So I think it's sort of that as Fred Madison gets madder and madder, the tape footage gets closer and closer, finally culminating in Fred murdering Renee. And the tapes don't lie, either. We know that based on something Fred and Renee say to the detectives. So let's turn to those guys. Now, it's true that David Lynch has described his ideal audience as doing detective work and being like detectives and following the clues and puzzling things over, but I think even without that knowledge, it can occur to the viewer that the detectives in Lost Highway are basically audience surrogates. Remember, the film opens up with a puzzling thing. We're meant to wonder what exactly is going on, and the detectives are there to wonder what exactly is going on. They're there to look at everything and investigate what's going on, like us. So I think in Lost Highway, the detectives are audience surrogates. This means that when a detective says something or asks something, that's David Lynch putting a thought or a question into our minds. If a detective asks something, that means we're supposed to ask that thing too. If a detective observes something, that means we're supposed to observe that thing too. The detectives in this sense are our guides. We're the rookie Sam, as it were, to their Chet Desmond. Sorry, I said I wouldn't reference other Lynch stuff. But anyway, and importantly, this is why the detectives from both halves of the movie can get together and talk to each other at the end of the film. The detectives collectively represent us, the audience, and we, the audience, have seen both parts of the film. So of course the detectives have also seen both parts of the film. And likewise, for the meaning of the remark, there's no such thing as a bad coincidence. And yes, I'll get to that. I'm getting a little ahead of myself. When the detectives first visit after the second videotape's delivery, they ask a couple of important questions, and because they ask those questions and they're audience surrogates, it means that we should be asking those questions too. One question is whether Fred and Renee have an alarm system. And they say that they do, but they never turn it on. The detectives ask why. Why don't you turn on your alarm system? And we are explicitly told, or the detectives are explicitly told, that the alarm system kept going off. What does this mean? Well, as a couple, Fred and Renee were setting off alarms. They were setting off alarms as a couple. And instead of heeding the alarms, they just turned the system off. Think about this metaphorically. We've already seen from that earlier scene how controlling Fred seems. And certainly when the detectives are talking to Fred and Renee, there's a weird kind of possessiveness. Renee's body language is shunted and slight. She looks to Fred for answers on behalf of both of them. She mentions only Fred's preferences when they talk about how they live. As a couple, they were setting off alarms, and they ignored them. More important than that, however, is the question about video cameras. One detective asks if they own a video camera, they say no, and specifically that Fred hates them. The detectives ask Fred what he means when he says he likes to remember things his own way. So we're supposed to wonder that too. We're supposed to think, hey, what does Fred mean when he says he likes to remember things his own way? And his answer is, how I remember them. Not necessarily how they happened, how I remember them. And this tells us a couple of very important things. First, there's the implication that a videotape tells things how they happened, how they actually happened. If they didn't, Fred wouldn't have the aversion to them. And secondly, that when Fred recalls things, he recalls them in a way that he likes. This is going to inform the idea that the second half of the film is not a dream, but a fugue state, or an attempt to construct a second self, a fantasy self, an attempt to transcend one's identity and just be another person. Anyway, I'm getting ahead of things. Based on what Fred says about his aversion to video cameras, we can infer both that yes, Fred did murder Renee, it's on camera, and yes, the later part of the film is a failed attempt at fantasy. Now, later in the film, detectives explicitly direct our attention first to how often Peter Dayton has sex with beautiful women, but also to the fact that Mr. Eddie is Dick Laurent. We learn through them. And that second observation is very, very important. It means that when Fred tells himself that Dick is dead right before perceiving emasculations to the point of being driven to spousal homicide, the thing he's talking about being dead is the same thing as Mr. Eddie, or whatever Mr. Eddie represents. But again, we're not quite to Peter Dayton. We've just got to Fred's murder. And about that. The scenes with Fred's incarceration tell us two things. First, that he has no memory of killing Renee, and second, that there's something wrong with his head. It's repeated over and over, there's something wrong with his head. This is after he also gasps in disbelief with a bloody nose after being told by a detective to sit down, kill her. Tell me I didn't kill her, he says. Tell me I didn't kill her. So, he doesn't think that he killed Renee, and there's something wrong with his head. But I also want to mention that I think the jail scenes are perhaps the only scenes of the film where we see Fred as he actually is. Remember, the first half of the film, I think, is basically from Fred's perspective. Renee seemed to be unfaithful to him, seemed to be emasculating him, but I don't think that's what his wife was actually doing. I think that's just how it seemed to him, and the first half of the film is shot that way, from his perspective. Likewise, in the film's second half, it's Fred attempting to be another person, and it has a fantasy element to it. Because of that, again, we don't see who Fred really is in the second half of the film. So I think only during these jail scenes do we get a glimmer of who Fred actually was. It's only a glimmer because not long after Fred gets some medicine for his head, specifically to help him sleep, and he goes back to his cell, we see something important. Just as he's trying to sleep in his cell, Fred, now established to be a heavily medicated murderer in denial, sees something interesting. Specifically, he sees his own murderous intent once again. The mystery man, his murderous intent. But this time, it's far away. His murderous intent is far away, and what's more, going into a little house where it's locked away. Instead of being right up and close to his own murderous intent like at Andy's party, now his murderous intent is distant and being shut into a little container. And once he shuts that murderous intent away, we move to the film's second half, which involves flashing blue lights and zooming in on Fred's head. And then we begin the fugue. Now, the order in which we get information is very important to figuring out what's going on. And there are two things that we learn almost simultaneously, but I'm going to say one first. The first thing that we learn is that they've got the wrong guy. They've got the wrong guy. Everyone agrees immediately. Even though it's weird, it makes no sense, it's physically impossible, it would be a lot easier to just say, hey, I guess Fred looked different from how we remember. And even though it would involve all kinds of bureaucratic layers and layers of paperwork, everyone just agrees, oh, it's the wrong guy, we got the wrong guy, we got the wrong guy. It just takes the lowliest prison guard to say something, and news travels all the way up to the warden within a couple of seconds who says, oh, we got the wrong guy, let him go. And the second thing that gets established almost at the same time is how Peter Dayton looks. Look at Peter Dayton. What does he look like? Describe it a certain way. Peter Dayton is a scarred young man. He's a scarred young man. He's just a little guy. He has a scar because, in Fred's mind, he's the one who's traumatized by all this. He's the one who's traumatized, and you can tell just by looking at him. He's a scarred young man, don't you know? This explains not only why the scar is there, but why it also heals almost immediately after he's out of jail. Is because the scar has performed its function. Fred isn't really traumatized. He's not the victim. Likewise, Peter isn't really scarred. So it goes away real fast. But we learn quite a bit about Peter Dayton just as we're introduced to him. And what we learn makes a lot of sense if you believe the Fugue interpretation. Fred wants to be a new guy, a different guy. Someone else. You got the wrong guy, I'm a scarred young man. But as for who Peter Dayton shows himself to be, or who he is in the fantasy, well, we see that once he's out of prison, Peter Dayton is young and handsome and has a beautiful girlfriend, and we're meant to notice his sexual success in particular because the detectives remark on it. But that's later. Pete is also the best mechanic around, and this is shown not only by Mr. Eddie's praise, but by the fact that Pete's colleagues look up to him. They're happy to see him back, they're all cheering for him. And all of this establishes that Pete has got it. What's that it? Why, it's the ability to have her. It's virility or dominance. It's masculine oomph. It's a toxic ideal, to be sure, but it's the thing that is represented by Dick Laurent. In the film's first half, Fred tells himself that his Dick Laurent is dead, and he's all insecure about it, and he sees everything as an emasculation, and so he murders Renee. But in this effort to construct a fantasy self, Peter Dayton has a very good relationship with the ideals of virility and dominance. And that's Mr. Eddie. But before we get to him, we should note that Pete is a mechanic, and he's an expert. He knows how to touch a body. He also works at Firestone Tires. What a rare coincidence of product placement and actual narrative usefulness. So Pete is young, Pete is full of virility and dominance, and Pete has the ability to have her. But importantly, Pete is not a symbol. He's not a symbol. The reason why is that Pete is our protagonist. It's from his point of view. Other people and characters can be symbols, but he is not. This is true in the film's first half as well. Peter Dayton is not like a symbol of male achievement, or a symbol of manliness, or a symbol of, well, the ability to have her. If we want a symbol that represents that toxic ideal, we must turn to As the film introduces Mr. Eddie, the detectives remark that that's the same person as Dick Laurent. So as Mr. Eddie is introduced, we're supposed to think that whatever Mr. Eddie stands for, whatever he is or represents, that's the thing whose death Fred announced to himself at the start of the film. Fred was announcing the death of something to himself at the start of the film, and doing so caused him to perceive a whole lot of emasculations. I wonder what it was. Well, let's turn to who Mr. Eddie is to inform that. Mr. Eddie is introduced with tough guy gangster music. He's surrounded by goons. Oh, I guess you can't say that. Gangster bodyguards. He's powerful, he's dominant, and he can kill anyone. And he really, really appreciates the fact that Peter Dayton is the best mechanic. So Mr. Eddie represents the masculine ability to have her, like male virility and dominance. Not as such traits exist in real life, to the extent they exist at all in the way they could, but in the way that Fred thinks of them. Mr. Eddie / Dick Laurent represent a toxic masculine ideal. The idea of virility and dominance and the ability to have her in a possessive sense. Now, if Mr. Eddie represents masculine virility and dominance and the ability to have her, this would also explain why at the beginning of the film, when Fred announces to himself that that thing is dead, that he perceives everything as an emasculation. He tells himself that his mojo is dead, and now he's insecure little angry guy, ultimately a murderer. I guess if they called him Mr. Mojo, it would have been pretty obvious. And on that note, why does Mr. Eddie also have another name, Dick Laurent, in both parts of the film? Well, an in-universe explanation might be gangsters have pseudonyms, but we're thinking symbolically. And I'm just going to throw this out there, but I think that both names are phallic. The surname Laurent refers to a laurel wreath, like a crown, like a symbol of kingdom. And Dick, of course, is slang for penis. So Dick Laurent is dead. It's kind of like saying King Penis is dead. It's like, one of those old operas that begin with the announcement of the dead king or whatever. King Penis is dead. And as for Mr. Eddie, well, I feel compelled to mention that most people have several different names for genitals or for their private parts. Not because people just make those things up, well, they do, but also, when people are growing up, like parents will tell kids, they're like, don't forget to wash, and then they'll use a term which is neither medical nor pornographic. They'll use some other term, like, Mr. Eddie, for instance. I've certainly heard people refer to Mr. Happy, and there being terms like that. I think Mr. Eddie's pseudonymity is at least partially owed to what he represents, i.e. this idea of male virility and dominance and the ability to have her. And if you're skeptical about that, why don't we turn to a scene that really shows what I mean, which is the tailgating scene. In addition to being a brilliantly crafted bit of Lynchian comedy, as well as a demonstration on how dangerous Mr. Eddie is, as well as a demonstration on how well Peter Dayton knows cars, the tailgating scene demonstrates something else. Suppose Mr. Eddie represents male virility and dominance, that sort of toxic ideal. That has cultural associations with mounting and penetrating as opposed to being mounted or being penetrated. To have masculine virility and dominance is to mount and to penetrate rather than to be mounted or to be penetrated. Now, with that in mind, how might that relate to tailgating? What doesn't Mr. Eddie like? He doesn't like being tailgated. It's the one thing he can't stand, he says. And how do people casually talk about tailgating? How do they do it? Well, they'll use language that's related to or sounds like mounting. People talk about riding their ass or being right on their ass, or even more graphic language besides that does involve penetration. There's a cultural association between tailgating and mounting or penetrating. Mr. Eddie represents that sort of virility and dominance, which is associated with mounting and penetrating, not being mounted or penetrated. So that's why it's the one thing he can't stand, is when someone tries to tailgate him, they are going to get it. And again, if that sounds weird or strange, remember, it's only a little while later we get this.
Give you a boner?
Everything has a purpose. So now we not only have Peter Dayton, but we have Mr. Eddie, who represents this sort of ideal, toxic ideal, but the ideal of virility and dominance and the ability to have her. We learn Peter Dayton has a great relationship with these ideals. We start out, Peter Dayton has a great relationship with his masculinity, let's say. But then something happens. Alice's entrance into the story not only establishes more that Peter Dayton is great at sex, but it also provides the crucial plot point, at least in the film's second half. Alice turns Mr. Eddie against Peter. In this way, Alice turns Peter's masculinity against him, and this is kind of a fantasy of Fred thinking that Renee turned his masculinity against him. And this proves to be incredibly dangerous. And it's important to note that the film presents Alice as actively doing this. Alice is the one that seduces Peter. Alice is the one that tricks him into committing crimes. Alice is the one who talks him into running away with her. And we can say, especially because of that first thing, it's Alice who turns Mr. Eddie against Peter. It's because of her that Peter becomes a man on the run on the Lost Highway. And here I think is a large part of why people label this film noir, in addition to kind of its aesthetic, is the role that Alice plays as a femme fatale. She's sexy and beautiful, but also dangerous and treacherous. The fact that such a character appears at the film's second half, which is the fantasy of a misogynist, I think is a clever move. Or rather, the fugue of a misogynist. Anyway, Alice seduces Peter and convinces him to commit a series of crimes, and that happens to be coextensive with his masculinity turning against him. It's also accompanied by depictions of Alice as a whore in the sense of both a pornographic actress as well as a prostitute. These facts are portrayed as being kind of pejorative, as cheapening Alice and by extension Peter Dayton. And again, this is all Fred's perspective. Now, as the film's second half proceeds, it's increasingly interrupted by elements from its first half. These are signs that Fred is failing in his efforts to become another person, to distance himself from who he is. These are all signs, in other words, that the fugue is faltering. There are 3 notable cases of this before the whole thing breaks down. First, shortly after Peter returns and has sex with his girlfriend, he hears a saxophone solo on the radio at work. And yes, it's the same saxophone solo that Fred plays, the musical portrayal of Fred struggling to keep it up. Peter leaps up and turns it off, and his colleague, an elderly man, asks a pointed question, "Why did you change that? I liked that." And Peter informs us that he does not like that. Later, just before Peter is about to leave with Alice for good, Peter's parents have an ominous conversation with him about an unspeakable event where Peter was there with an indescribable man in a way that their body language and their conversational tone suggest was horrifying. And I think the logic of the film goes something like this, that because they are Peter's parents, they know where Peter came from. But Peter came from Fred's efforts to become a different person. So in some sense, Peter's parents have this dim awareness of what their son really is. They can't say what he really is, though, because saying so is incompatible with the very efforts of which they're a part, or the very fugue of which they're a part, or the very fantasy of which they're a part. The parents love Peter because they're his parents, but they also know where he came from because they're his parents, and they can't really say. They can only gesture in fear because they're his parents in this fantasy. And this conversation isn't just one that ingeniously connects the flickering, screaming introduction of Peter to the creation of an imaginary being. It's also a case of Fred's fugue faltering. That is to say, Fred's fantasy is failing, or reality is breaking through. Now, the final sign of the fugue faltering, or the fugue breaking down, is when Peter and Alice are in Andy's house after having murdered him, and Peter sees the photo, which appears to have both Alice and Renee. This causes his nose to bleed and his head to hurt and for him to be confused. Alice, who's part of the fantasy, just says, "That's me," pointing at herself in the picture. But Peter, irritated in the same way he was when he heard the saxophone solo at work, just more so, can tell that something is very, very wrong. All of these are occasions where reality is breaking through, where the fugue, as it were, or the fantasy world that is being constructed, is faltering. Eventually, when Peter and Alice drive away together, drive far, far away, they end up coming closer and closer to Fred's murderous intent. And once they're right there, everything breaks down. But before talking about that, let's mention the detectives again. Remember, since the detectives are audience surrogates, since they represent us, in other words, they can examine and compare different parts of the film and all the characters that appear in any part of the film. This is why near the end, when the detectives all get together and ask what happened and who this person is, we get told definitively, there's no such thing as a bad coincidence. Now, this is not a specific remark about anything in the film. Instead, as is always the case when a detective says something, David Lynch is putting something into our minds as audience members. Lynch is telling us there's no such thing as a bad coincidence. If you notice a coincidence, in other words, that's good. That's something that you should think about as a detective would. If you notice a coincidence, do detective work on that. That's what he's saying. How nice. Anyway, as I was saying, Peter and Alice drive far, far away together. They go out onto the Lost Highway, and they get to where the murderous intent of Fred lives. Or at least where the murderous intent has been sort of locked up, and maybe you should say repressed. And it's here, around the Lost Highway Hotel, where Fred's effort to be someone else, or the fugue in which he is someone else, just breaks down completely. When Alice and Peter make love, she says, "You'll never have me," which puts Peter in the very same situation that Fred was in. Fred couldn't have Renee. He didn't have the ability to have her. Peter can't have Alice. He doesn't have the ability to have her. Fred, at least initially, was close to murderous intent. It was right by his house, and then he came in and he talked to it. And he tried to get away. Peter started out away, far away from Fred's murderous intent, but now, because of Alice, he's been driven back to it. He's been driven back to murderous intent. So we've gone full circle. Neither Fred nor Peter can have her. Neither one has virility or masculinity now. And both of them are close to murderous intent. All of this is why Peter turns back into Fred out there. The whole point of being another person, that is, to have her and to be away from murderous intent, has failed. So there is no other self. We're back to being Fred. And for a moment, Fred tries to continue to live in the fantasy by asking about Alice. But at that point, he's way too close to his own murderous intent. He knows better. Even his own murderous intent says to him, her name is Renee. And he can no longer run away from who he is. So then Fred kills Mr. Eddie, and you might think, wait, how does this make sense from the whole perspective? If Mr. Eddie represents the masculine ideal of being able to have her with virility and dominance, why would he kill that? But consider the idea that, from Fred's perspective, this woman turned his own masculinity against him, weaponized it. So he says, to hell with it. To hell with everything, kill everything, including my own stupid virility. The killing of Mr. Eddie is interpsychic conflict. It's psychological. It's him attacking his own, well, not ideals, toxic ideals, but it's definitely self-loathing. And note that Fred doesn't attack his own murderous intent. He doesn't blame that for anything. He blames his own stupid virility, his own stupid mojo, as you will. And after that act of violence, Fred races out into the night. So the journey that Fred goes on has a sort of spiral shape, a kind of downward spiral, for reasons I'm going to explain. First of all, the journey he goes on is a psychological one. It's an inner journey, a mental journey. It goes from insecurity to violent impulse, to insecurity, to violent impulse, to insecurity again. It loops a couple of times. In principle, this sort of circularity could continue forever, but not in Fred's case, because in real life, or in real life according to the film, Fred is about to be executed by electrocution. And so he is. Fred's inner journey attempts to continue on that same spiral, with Fred driving into the night after once again telling himself that his dick is dead. So it would seem he's moving again from insecurity to violence. But since he's being executed in real life, he appears to immolate, that is, catch fire at the wheel with an electrical sort of light, and he's jerking and jostling and spasming in the same way someone would if they were being electrocuted. So this is how both Fred dies at the end, but also how the film's narrative is a loop or a Mobius strip. It's a psychological loop, and because it's a psychological narrative, that also means it's a narrative loop. We get Fred's perceived emasculation leading to violence against Renee, leading to an effort to become someone else which only produces more violence based on insecurity, and the loop's about to repeat a third time when Fred is executed. So this brings me back to my precise theses that I'm going to add to the Fugue interpretation, or the murderer's Fugue interpretation of Lost Highway. First, that the film's narrative loop is not temporal, it's psychological. It's insecurity leading to violence, leading to insecurity. Fred tells himself that Dick is dead, which leads him to murder Renee, which leads him to tell himself that Dick is dead while murdering Dick, which leads him to tell himself that Dick is dead. It's a crazy downward psychological spiral, and the whole motor that is driving this spiral is Fred's dark, toxic obsession with the ability to have her, some kind of virility or dominance associated with masculinity. He tells himself that his Dick Laurent is dead, and he gets so insecure about it, he gets murderous. The film is from his perspective, and he is an actual villain, a detestable guy, a guy that you have no reason to identify with or like or sympathize with. You're not supposed to think Fred is a good guy. You're not supposed to think he's cool, because he's not cool. But you are supposed to be fascinated and puzzled by his story, and not just the story, but specifically the film in which David Lynch tells it. So there's my interpretation of Lost Highway, a tale of the cycle between masculine insecurity and violence. I hope you found my detective work to be enjoyable. Please let me know what you think in the comments. If you saw this video on Patreon, thank you very, very, very much. If not, please know that you could have seen this earlier on Patreon, link in the doobly-doo, and thank you very much again.